Hey everybody, so there's a ton of information out there in the web, in the libraries, in humanity in general. How do you make sense of that? Books are a great resource. Lectures, videos are other great resources, but sometimes you have to get really down to the core, down to the source. And this is where the skill of knowing how to read academic papers is really critical. And that's what we're gonna get into today. So how do you read a scientific article, especially if you have no academic background? So I have a paper here on my iPad called Why is Conscientiousness Negatively Correlated with Intelligence? And I'm gonna use this paper as an example. Let's first get into the structure, because scientific articles have a really specific structure that they all pretty much follow. Every scientific paper starts with the abstract, and the abstract describes in shorthand what the paper is about, what they found, etc. Then we have the introduction. The introduction describes the background, why is this research being conducted, previous research in the field, and then it also has the hypotheses, which we're gonna go into later. So there are 3 hypotheses in this paper specifically, but we'll get into those later. Then, after the introduction, we have the method, which describes the scientific method that the researchers went through to arrive at the conclusions, which is the next part, so results. What results were we able to derive from this research? That's the results section. Then, after that, we have the discussion. It sometimes is called conclusions, sometimes it's called discussion, sometimes it's called something different. The specific titles don't matter that much. What matters is that there is a section that talks about the results and the significance of those, and perhaps further research that needs to be conducted in the field and suggestions regarding that. And then finally, as the last stage, we have the references. So all of the papers that the authors cited in this specific article are mentioned as a list here. So that's the basic structure of an academic paper. So how do you then actually run through that? So what I like to do is I like to first read the abstract. This way I get a base level understanding of what the paper is about, and it's easier to read all the rest of the chapters. Then I like to go through the introduction, and specifically the reason for that is I want to know the background. There's a lot of terminology that the authors are going to use later on in the paper that gets explained in the introduction. So for example, here in this specific paper, the authors mentioned that it's important to clarify the distinction between fluid intelligence and crystallized intelligence in order to understand why personality is related to intelligence. And that's a very crucial piece of information as the study goes on. Another thing that's really important in the introduction are the hypotheses that the authors present. So in this paper, there are 3 hypotheses, for example. The first is that C, which is conscientiousness in this case, will be negatively correlated with both as measured by abstract and verbal reasoning, respectively. So this in English means that if you are very high in conscientiousness, you'll be lower in intelligence. That's what negative correlation means. So that's the first hypothesis. The second hypothesis is that C, again conscientiousness, will be more highly correlated with abstract reasoning than with verbal reasoning. And then finally, the third hypothesis follows on from there and states that the subfactors of conscientiousness will significantly negatively correlate with abstract and verbal reasoning. After I've understood all of the hypotheses and everything else that's relevant in the introduction section, I like to skip through the method for now and also the results for now. And I like to jump straight to the discussion or the conclusion section of the study because it tends to be a briefer chapter, it tends to be a bit less complicated, a bit less mathematical. In this case, I'm not a big mathematical thinker, so it's easier for me to understand what the math means when I read it only after I get the meaning of the math, if that makes sense. So in the discussion stage, they first reiterate the first hypothesis and the second hypothesis. The third hypothesis doesn't need to be reiterated because it logically follows on from those too. So when all of those are true, then the third hypothesis is true as well. So here we find that although the correlation of conscientiousness with abstract reasoning and verbal reasoning was indeed negative, it was not statistically significant for verbal intelligence or verbal reasoning once the effect of neuroticism, extroversion, openness, and agreeableness were parceled out. So those are the other four personality dimensions of the Big Five personality model. The second hypothesis was that conscientiousness would be more highly correlated with abstract reasoning than with verbal reasoning, suggesting that conscientiousness is more highly correlated with fluid than with crystallized intelligence. And the results were somewhat unsatisfying because they were not, this is exactly like this, and this is the absolute truth, and this is the whole of the topic until the rest of human existence. And this is also an important lesson from science, because things are never as simple as they seem. There's so much complexity in the world, and especially, topics such as personality, intelligence, you can't draw simple conclusions from those topics. And that, I think, is a very important lesson in understanding and knowing how to read scientific articles. There is a sort of deepening of thought that happens concurrently. But what is very interesting is this little chapter right here. So the finding that conscientiousness was significantly correlated with fluid intelligence but not with crystallized intelligence indicates that the direction of causality in the relationship between intelligence and conscientiousness must be that intelligence affects the development of conscientiousness. So if you are, essentially what they argue is that if you are very intelligent, you tend to be less conscientious because things are handed out to you. And this, you can see this in, for example, elementary school. If the really intelligent kids are running through all of the math exercises, not essentially learning anything new. They don't read for the tests. They don't study very hard. And when you compare that to the less intelligent students in, for example, fluid intelligence, those students have to work harder to get to the same result. So therefore, they end up learning how to be more efficient, learning how to schedule things, learning how to work hard. And that essentially is what conscientiousness is. And this is the really interesting part about reading scientific papers, especially, psychological papers, for example, because they tend to sometimes describe things that you observe in the real world, but can't exactly reason why things happen. So by understanding, for example, this phenomenology behind the relationship between conscientiousness and intelligence helps me describe the world in a better way. After you've read through all of that, you can go back to the method and the results to understand how these specific results were achieved. And from there, you can use the paper. What I like to do is I like to write up notes in my notebook or on my computer, somewhere where I'll keep them safe and where I'll return to them so that I can utilize this information, for example, when writing posts on social media, when doing videos like this, when writing my book, which I'm doing right now. That's the very important last part in actually applying the knowledge that you gain, is to put it down somewhere that you'll refer to it later and use it. But that's essentially how I like to read academic papers. If you are looking for academic papers that you'd like to read or to find out academic literature, you can go to a website called academia.edu. There you can find papers for free. You can download PDFs. They also have a premium subscription where you get some added benefits for the search and things like that. I'm not sponsored in any case. That's what I've just used, and that's where I, for example, found this paper. And so that's a resource that you can use if you'd like. I hope you found this helpful, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.